Hey everyone, I've noticed that many of you are enjoying the videos, but most of you haven't subscribed yet. We're super close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and your support could help us reach that milestone. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really makes a huge difference and helps us keep creating more awesome content. Thank you so much for watching and supporting. Morning light filtered through the blinds, casting stripes across the room. Another Tuesday. Another day that felt too much like the one before. I sat at the kitchen counter, stirring a half-empty mug of coffee, watching the swirls mix into nothing. Lily had left early, too early for the excuse she gave me last night. Meeting at work, she said, her eyes not quite meeting mine. I didn't push it. I never pushed it. Routine. That's what I told myself. People have lives, jobs. Some days they leave earlier. Some days they're tired, quiet, distant. But I wasn't dumb. Something had shifted between us, something subtle, creeping like a shadow I couldn't quite pin down. I'd noticed it a few months ago, tiny details that began to claw at my mind, planting seeds of doubt. At first, I brushed them off, chalked it up to the usual wear and tear of a marriage. But now those doubts had grown roots, deep and twisting. Lily used to wear the same scent for years, a subtle jasmine perfume I could pick out from a mile away. Now it was something else, something new. Vanilla, musk, unfamiliar. She never mentioned switching, but I noticed. I noticed how her phone never left her hand, and when it did, it was face down, hidden, like there were things she didn't want me to see. And then there were the nights, late nights at the office that started happening more often, too often. The distance between us, once filled with small, easy conversations, had grown into a chasm. Words were scarce, and when they came, they felt forced, rehearsed, like she was only saying what she thought she had to. I downed the rest of my coffee and grabbed my keys. The house felt colder these days, like it had lost its warmth along with whatever had been slipping between Lily and me. My footsteps echoed through the hall as I left, the click of the door shutting behind me, a sound I'd grown too accustomed to. Outside, the crisp fall air bit at my skin, waking me up in ways coffee couldn't. Work was the same as always. Colleagues exchanging pleasantries, emails piling up, meetings that blurred into one another. I tried to focus, tried to sink into the comfort of routine, but something gnawed at the back of my mind, pulling me out of my tasks and into the pit of doubt that had been growing inside me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was there, lurking, waiting for me to acknowledge it. Around lunchtime, I caught sight of a text from Lily. Nothing suspicious, just a quick, "Hope your day's going well." But the words felt hollow, like she was checking a box, keeping up appearances. I replied with a, "You too," then stared at my screen, wondering if this was all in my head. "Matt, you all right?" A voice pulled me out of my thoughts. It was Tim, a guy from accounting who always seemed too chipper for someone surrounded by numbers all day. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind," I muttered, forcing a smile. "Don't work too hard, man. You've been looking pretty zoned out lately." "Everything okay at home?" he asked, his tone casual, but the words hit like a knife. I nodded. "Yeah, all good." Tim gave me a knowing look but didn't push further. He walked away, leaving me with his parting words echoing in my head. "You've been looking pretty zoned out lately. Was it that obvious?" Could people see it on me, the weight I'd been carrying around, the constant unease? I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been gripping the arms of my chair until my fingers ached. There was something wrong, something festering beneath the surface, but I didn't have proof, just feelings, gut instincts, and a growing suspicion that was driving me mad. The rest of the day passed in a blur of emails, phone calls, and forced small talk. I wasn't present. My mind was elsewhere, circling the same thoughts over and over again. By the time I left the office, dusk had fallen, casting long shadows on the streets. I drove home on autopilot, my body going through the motions while my mind stayed tangled in a web of uncertainty. When I pulled into the driveway, the house stood silent, dark. Lily wasn't home yet, which wasn't unusual these days. She often worked late, meetings, she'd say. I walked inside, the cold silence of the house greeting me like an old friend. I poured myself a drink, letting the burn of the whiskey distract me, if only for a moment. The nights were the hardest. It was when the distance between us felt the most real. I'd wait for her, sometimes staying up later than I should, hoping for a conversation that never came, for some sign that things were still okay. But when she came home, it was always the same. Tired excuses, quick showers, and an even quicker retreat to bed. She'd slip in beside me, our backs turned, the space between us growing wider with every night. I sat on the couch, nursing my drink, staring at nothing in particular. My mind wandered, replaying moments from the past few months. It was like watching a movie, scenes flashing by, her phone buzzing late at night, her subtle change in perfume, the way she'd laugh at something on her screen, and then quickly close it when I walked into the room. The puzzle pieces were there, scattered, but none of them fit together. Not yet. By the time I heard the door open, it was almost midnight. Lily walked in, her coat draped over her arm, her hair slightly disheveled. She glanced at me briefly before setting her things down. "Hey," she said, her voice casual, detached. "Long day." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The tension was thick, but she didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she just didn't care. "I'm going to shower," she said, already heading down the hall before I could respond. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving me alone with my thoughts once again. I stared at the empty glass in my hand, the weight of everything pressing down on me. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. We were supposed to be happy. We were supposed to talk, to share our lives. But now? Now it felt like we were just two strangers occupying the same space, pretending everything was fine when it was anything but. I stood up, the alcohol buzzing through my veins, and walked to the bedroom. Her phone was on the nightstand, face down like always. I stared at it for a moment, the temptation to pick it up gnawing at me. But I didn't. Not yet. I wasn't that guy, the one who snooped through his wife's phone, searching for answers he wasn't ready to find. Instead, I grabbed my phone and lay back on the bed, scrolling through emails, texts, anything to distract myself from the growing pit in my stomach. But even that didn't work. My mind kept drifting back to her, to the way she'd been acting, to the feeling that something, someone, was coming between us. She emerged from the bathroom a few minutes later, towel wrapped around her, her hair damp. She gave me a tired smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're up late," she said, slipping into bed beside me. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep." She nodded, rolling onto her side, her back to me. I watched her for a moment, the rise and fall of her breathing, the way her hair fanned out on the pillow. She was so close, and yet I'd never felt further away from her. I turned off the light, plunging the room into darkness, but sleep didn't come. I lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The house was too quiet, too still. It felt like something was waiting, lurking in the shadows, ready to rip everything apart. And maybe it was. Maybe the reason I couldn't shake this feeling, the reason everything felt wrong, was because it was wrong. Maybe my life, my marriage, the woman lying beside me, wasn't what I thought it was. I didn't have proof, not yet, but the pieces were there, and soon enough, they'd come together. The tension was building, and I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't going to end well. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Lily moving around the kitchen. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, but I stayed in bed, listening. The clink of a mug, the soft hum of the coffee maker, the muted footsteps as she crossed the floor. It was all too normal, too routine for the strange coldness that had seeped into our lives. I sat up, rubbing my eyes and checking the clock. 6:15. She didn't usually leave until 7:30. That early departure had become more common recently, and it wasn't lost on me. By the time I made my way downstairs, she was halfway out the door, her coat thrown over one arm and her phone in the other. "Leaving early?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. She paused, giving me a quick, almost startled glance. "Yeah, something came up at work. I've got a meeting I can't be late for." It wasn't the first time I'd heard that excuse, and I doubted it would be the last. "Another meeting?" "You've had a lot of those lately." Her eyes flicked to the side just for a second, but it was enough. "I know. she said, forcing a smile. It's been crazy. I'll make it up to you this weekend, okay? Sure, I replied, my voice flat, disbelieving. She turned and hurried out the door before I could say anything more. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, my mind racing. It was the little things that were starting to add up. She was always so quick to leave, to escape, like there was somewhere else she'd rather be. I used to believe her, used to brush off the creeping doubts, but now, it felt like every word she said was loaded with something unsaid, something she didn't want me to know. I grabbed my phone from the counter and sat down with my coffee, scrolling through the news as a distraction. But it didn't work. I couldn't focus. Instead, I found myself thinking back to the nights she'd come home late, offering a vague explanation about how she and some colleagues had gone out after work. At the time, it seemed harmless, normal even. But now, it felt like something else entirely. I shook my head and downed the rest of my coffee. I wasn't going to let my imagination run wild. I had to get through the day. By lunchtime, I'd made it through the usual flood of emails and meetings, but my mind was anywhere but work. Every time my phone buzzed, I found myself glancing at it, half expecting some message from Lily that would explain everything. But it never came. I stared at her last message from earlier in the morning. Meeting today, see you tonight. Short, simple, and devoid of any real meaning. Just enough to keep me at bay. My thumb hovered over her contact for a moment, tempted to call, but what would I even say? Hey, I'm just checking if you're really at work like you said. It sounded ridiculous, paranoid even. But then, wasn't that how I felt? Trapped in this constant loop of second-guessing everything she did? I thought back to the days when it wasn't like this. We used to be in sync, our conversations flowing easily, our weekends spent together, laughing over dinner or spending time with friends. Now, it was like we were on separate tracks, moving in opposite directions. She had her world, her job, her meetings, and I was left wondering when, or if, we'd meet in the middle again. Tim popped his head into my office, a grin on his face. Hey, a bunch of us are heading to lunch. You want to join? I blinked, shaking off my thoughts. No, I think I'll pass today. Got a lot on my plate. Suit yourself, he said with a shrug, disappearing down the hall. I leaned back in my chair, staring up at the ceiling. Something was wrong. I wasn't just imagining it. Lily wasn't just tired or stressed. There was more to it. I could feel it in my gut, and as much as I wanted to ignore it, I couldn't. Not anymore. That evening, I was home before Lily again. I'd made myself dinner, something simple, pasta and a salad, which sat mostly untouched. I wasn't hungry. I was too distracted, my mind buzzing with thoughts I couldn't shake. It was close to 10 when I heard her come in. The door clicked shut softly, and her footsteps were light, careful. I stayed where I was, sitting at the table with a beer, pretending to scroll through my phone. I didn't look up when she entered the kitchen. Hey, she said quietly, setting her purse down on the counter. You're up late. I nodded. Yeah, couldn't sleep. She moved around the kitchen, opening cabinets and pouring herself a glass of water. I watched her. The way her movements were so mechanical, so distant. This wasn't the Lily I married. The woman I knew was warm, engaged, always quick to talk about her day or ask about mine. This version of her was a ghost, passing through the house without leaving a trace. Long day? I asked, forcing myself to keep my tone neutral. Yeah, she sighed, running a hand through her hair. Work's been tough lately. Another late meeting? She hesitated for a beat too long before answering. Yeah. Just wrapping up some projects. I nodded again, though the knot in my stomach tightened. Seems like work's been keeping you busy. She gave me a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. You know how it is? I did, or at least I used to, but this felt different. She excused herself to bed not long after, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stared at the empty space where she'd stood, my mind racing. How long could I keep doing this? How long could I keep pretending that nothing was wrong? I grabbed my phone and opened our shared calendar. She'd always been meticulous about marking her meetings, but lately there were gaps, empty blocks of time that she'd never explained. Maybe I'd never thought to ask, but now those gaps seemed like black holes, swallowing up the parts of her life she didn't want me to see. I swiped through the past few months, trying to piece together a timeline. The late nights had started around the same time she changed her perfume. Coincidence? Maybe. But now, it felt like another puzzle piece sliding into place. I was done waiting for answers to come to me. It was time to start asking questions. The next day, I couldn't focus at work. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped. But it was never from her. I found myself scrutinizing her texts from the past few weeks, short, clipped responses, like she was only going through the motions. Around midday, I finally broke. I needed more than vague suspicions and gut feelings. I needed proof. I drove home early, hours before Lily would be back. The house was still, the silence weighing on me as I crossed the living room and headed upstairs. I knew where she kept her laptop. She always left it in the office, in her desk drawer. My pulse quickened as I pulled it out and flipped it open. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just work emails, spreadsheets, the usual. But then I saw it. A message from someone named Nathan, tucked away in a folder she'd labeled personal. My heart pounded as I clicked it open. "Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. When can we see each other again? Love you, Nathan." The words blurred in front of me. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, my breath knocked out of me in one swift blow. My hands shook as I scrolled through more of their emails. Months. They'd been doing this for months. Meeting up, sneaking around, behind my back, in my house. I slammed the laptop shut, my body trembling with rage, disbelief, and hurt all at once. I couldn't breathe. The room spun around me as I stood up, my legs shaky beneath me. All those late nights, all those meetings. It was him, Nathan. Some guy I'd never even heard of, living a parallel life with my wife. The humiliation hit me hard, like a sharp slap to the face. She'd been lying to me for so long, weaving this entire web of deception right under my nose, and I had let her. I stumbled into the bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink, trying to steady myself. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, my face pale, my eyes wide and hollow. This couldn't be real. But it was. The proof was right there. I thought back to every little sign I'd ignored. Her phone face down, the new perfume, the late nights, the way she'd brush me off like I was an inconvenience. It all made sense now. It had always been there, staring me in the face, and I hadn't wanted to see it. I clenched my fists, the anger rising inside me like a tidal wave. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Lily had no idea what was coming next. This wouldn't go unanswered. When she came home that night, I pretended nothing had changed. I played the role of the clueless husband, just as I had for months. But behind my silence, the wheels were already turning. She thought she'd gotten away with it. But I wasn't the fool she thought I was. Not anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. The weight of what I'd uncovered sat heavy in my chest, like a boulder pressing down on my lungs. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, Lily, laughing at something on her phone, smiling at some message from Nathan, the same way she used to smile at me. The betrayal cut deep, but the anger, that went deeper. By morning, the numbness had worn off, and something colder, sharper, took its place. It wasn't enough to confront her. It wasn't enough to shout, throw her out, or demand answers she'd lie her way through anyway. No, if this was going to hurt, if this was going to matter, then it needed to be precise, calculated. I had to make sure she felt the same devastation she'd carved into me, only slower, like the drip of water torture, one drop at a time. I showered, dressed, and went through the motions of a normal morning. Lily was already gone, another meeting, no doubt. It worked in my favor. I needed time to think, to plan. I didn't just want her to feel guilty. Guilt wasn't enough. I wanted her to feel humiliated, for everything she built to crumble. First, I needed to find out who Nathan really was. He wasn't some faceless fling anymore. He was real, tangible. And more importantly, he had a life of his own, a wife, Heather. I found her on social media within minutes, a few clicks, and there she was, pretty, blonde, a few years older than Lily. She seemed normal enough, happy even, based on the curated pictures she posted. They looked like the kind of couple you'd invite over for dinner. I clicked through her profile, gathering details. They had kids, a boy, about 10, and a younger girl. I felt a flicker of pity for her. The same betrayal that had gutted me was coming for her too, whether she knew it or not. But she deserved to know. She needed to be a part of this, and if I could use her to rip apart their lives, so much the better. I spent the next hour digging deeper into Nathan. He was a lawyer, partner at a local firm. That explained the late nights. I wondered how many of those meetings had really been spent with my wife. There was a lot to unravel, but I had time. I wasn't going to rush this. When Lily got home that night, I played my part perfectly. Dinner on the table, wine already poured. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing like she was trying to gauge my mood, but I kept my expression light, neutral. "How was your day?" I asked, casually sipping my drink. "Long," she replied, rubbing the back of her neck like she was exhausted. She moved around the kitchen, grabbing a plate, pretending everything was fine. I watched her, forcing down the urge to confront her right there, to let the truth spill out. But I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. Not yet. I had bigger plans. The next morning, I sent Heather a message. It was simple. Just a few words that would start the unraveling. I didn't say too much, just enough to get her attention. "I think we need to talk about your husband and my wife." It didn't take long for her to reply. The message came in within the hour. "What do you mean?" I left her hanging for a while, let her stew in her own thoughts, her own suspicions. Then I responded. "It's about Nathan and Lily. We should meet." We arranged to meet at a small coffee shop the next day. I didn't tell her much more, just enough to ensure she showed up. She didn't ask too many questions, but I could sense the fear in her curt responses, the growing unease. The next morning, I walked into the cafe and spotted her immediately. She was sitting by the window, fidgeting with her phone. She looked nervous, her eyes scanning the room as if she wasn't sure who she was waiting for. I recognized that look. It was the look of someone about to have their world torn apart. "Heather?" I asked, approaching her table. She looked up, her brow furrowing as she took me in. "Matt?" I nodded, taking a seat across from her. She stared at me, and I could see the questions in her eyes, the fear gnawing at the edges of her composure. "Can you tell me what this is about?" she asked, her voice wavering. I took a breath, leaning back in my chair. "It's about Nathan and Lily. They've been having an affair." Her face paled, and she blinked rapidly, as if trying to process what I just said. "What? No, that's not possible. It's been going on for months, maybe longer. I've seen the emails." The texts. Her hands trembled as she reached for her coffee, her fingers gripping the cup tightly. "I don't understand. Nathan, we're—" I let her trail off, watching as the reality sank in, the same way it had for me just days ago. The shock, the disbelief. It was all too familiar. But I didn't feel sorry for her. Not really. This was a necessary step in the plan. "I'm sorry," I said, though I wasn't. "I thought you deserved to know." She sat there stunned, her mind clearly racing. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "I'm sure." For a long moment, she said nothing, just stared out the window, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then she looked back at me, and I saw something shift in her eyes, something hard and cold. "What do we do?" she asked. That was all I needed. The alliance was formed. We had the same goal now, tear them apart, and we would. Back at home, I continued playing my part. I became the perfect husband, attentive, considerate. I even suggested we plan a weekend getaway, just the two of us. Lily smiled at the suggestion, but I could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the tension she tried to hide. She didn't trust me, and I didn't trust her. But for now, we were still pretending. I started subtly laying the groundwork for her to slip, asking casual questions about her schedule, dropping hints about conversations I'd had with mutual friends. Each time, I watched her carefully, noting the slight panic that flashed across her face. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I wanted her paranoid. I wanted her to feel the same suffocating dread I'd been living with. Heather, meanwhile, was unraveling her own part of the plan. She hadn't confronted Nathan yet, but she was gathering information, following his movements, checking his emails. She was angry, and that anger fueled everything we did. I kept feeding her small bits of what I knew, guiding her, but not too quickly. This wasn't about blowing things up all at once. This was about the slow, steady collapse of everything they thought they had. Just as we were about to make our move, a complication arose. Nathan left town, an urgent work trip. The timing couldn't have been worse. We'd been planning to confront them together, but now we had to adjust. Heather was furious, her texts short and clipped. She was ready to explode, but I told her to wait. Nathan would be back. We just had to bide our time. In the meantime, Lily was starting to grow suspicious. She was jumpy, defensive. I could see it in the way she avoided eye contact, the way her smile seemed forced. She knew something was off, but she didn't know what. She didn't know I was already 2 steps ahead. Every night, I watched her closely, waiting for her to slip up. She was careful, too careful, but even the best liars make mistakes eventually. I planted subtle seeds of doubt, dropped comments that made her squirm, watched her phone out of the corner of my eye when it buzzed with notifications. She was starting to unravel, just like I'd planned. Then I uncovered something I hadn't expected. Through a few discreet inquiries, I learned that Nathan wasn't just some random affair. He and Lily were discussing a future together. She was already planning her exit strategy, laying the groundwork for a divorce. I'd always assumed I'd be the one to make the first move, to pull the rug out from under her, but now I realized she'd been planning the same. Nathan, being a lawyer, was no doubt advising her on how to navigate the legal side of things. She'd been playing me just as much as I was playing her. But that changed nothing. If anything, it only fueled my determination. Time was running out, and if this was going to end the way I wanted, I had to act fast. Lily's world was about to fall apart, and I would make sure she never saw it coming. I was waiting for the call when it came. Heather had texted me a half hour before to let me know she was on her way to Lily's office, her words clipped and full of anger. I could picture it, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her mind running through everything she would say, how she would say it. I hadn't needed to push her too hard. The emails, the pictures I'd sent her, they were enough. She was furious, broken, just like I had been. Now she was about to light the match. I paced the living room, my phone in hand, waiting for the inevitable fallout. It felt like standing on the edge of something huge, the kind of moment that you can never take back. A part of me felt sick, twisted up with the anticipation of it all. But the rest of me was cold, detached. Lily had betrayed me. She'd carved her infidelity into the fabric of our lives, staining every memory, every moment we'd shared. I couldn't scream, couldn't cry. Those were reactions for people still holding on to something. I wasn't. All I had left was the calculation, the steps I'd put in motion to destroy her the way she'd destroyed me. My phone buzzed and I looked down at the screen. Heather. Hello, I answered, my voice steady, controlled. It's done, she breathed into the phone, her voice shaking but triumphant. I did it. I could hear the adrenaline in her tone, the tremble of someone who had just crossed a line and was only now feeling the weight of it. I imagined the scene, Heather storming into Lily's office, her hand gripping a fistful of my wife's hair, dragging her out into the hall. Lily wouldn't have expected it. She would have been blindsided, humiliated in front of her coworkers, her perfect image shattered in an instant. There would have been gasps, stares, whispered conversations that would spiral into gossip by the end of the day. It would follow her for the rest of her career. Did she fight back? I asked, almost curious. Heather laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that cracked at the edges. She didn't know what hit her. She tried to pull away, but I didn't let go. I dragged her out of there, Matt, just like we talked about. People saw. They were staring, whispering. I threw the divorce papers at her. I closed my eyes, letting the image wash over me. I had timed it perfectly. The papers I'd had drawn up weeks before, the ones Lily had no idea about, were delivered to her in front of everyone, signed and sealed. She thought she was playing me, preparing her own exit strategy with Nathan, but I had already beaten her to it. I wondered what her face looked like when she saw my name on those papers, the realization sinking in that she'd been outmaneuvered. Good, I said. It's all falling apart for her now. There was a silence on the other end, the kind that stretched thin before breaking. Heather cleared her throat. Matt, what do we do now? Now, I said, my voice low. We finish what we started. While Heather had been handling the public humiliation, I had taken care of the rest. Over the past few days, I'd been busy. First, I tipped off a journalist friend, someone who owed me a favor about Lily and Nathan's affair. A quiet, anonymous message sent to the right inbox, just enough to spark an investigation. I knew it wouldn't take much for the news to spread. Then I reached out to Nathan's firm. Another anonymous email. This one wasn't just about the affair. It was about Nathan's professional conduct, or lack thereof. I'd found enough to suggest he was using company resources for his little rendezvous with Lily. A few more breadcrumbs, and suddenly Nathan wasn't just a cheating husband. He was a liability to the firm. It was only a matter of time before they investigated him, and when they did, his career would crumble. I had spent the last few months learning how to move in the shadows. I knew how to plant seeds, drop hints, and let people's own fears do the rest. Lily and Nathan's downfall wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be some dramatic explosion. It would be quiet, methodical, like pulling a thread and watching everything unravel. Lily's office would be buzzing by now. Her coworkers wouldn't say it to her face, but behind her back. They'd be dissecting every detail, questioning every work trip, every urgent meeting. That perfect image she'd crafted for herself, career-driven, respected, admired, was gone. And with Nathan's own career in jeopardy, she was losing her escape route too. I watched the clock. By now, Lily would be back at home, trying to make sense of what had happened. She'd see the divorce papers on the floor where Heather had thrown them. She'd know I was behind it, that I'd known everything for longer than she realized. Her entire life, the one she'd built on deception, was about to collapse, and I wasn't even there to see it. I didn't need to be. When I finally got home, it was late. The house was dark, except for the dim glow of the living room lamp. The air felt thick, like it was holding on to the chaos that had erupted earlier in the day. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me quietly. Lily was sitting on the couch, her eyes red and swollen. She had the divorce papers spread out in front of her, a glass of wine untouched on the table. She looked up as I entered, her face a mixture of anger, confusion, and something else. Fear, maybe. She hadn't expected this. She thought she was in control, that she could pull the strings. Now, she was realizing how wrong she'd been. Matt, she said, her voice cracking, we need to talk. I said nothing, moving past her, my eyes scanning the room. I'd already emptied it of anything meaningful, personal items, things that mattered to me. It had been methodical. Everything else, the shell of what our life had been, I left behind. I wasn't staying here anymore. This was her mess now. Why are you doing this? She continued, standing up, her hands shaking. I know you're angry, but we can fix this. We can talk. I turned to face her, feeling the weight of her words hanging between us, but they meant nothing. There was no anger left in me, no emotion at all, really. Just the cold, detached satisfaction of a plan that had unfolded perfectly. You don't get it, do you? I said, my voice calm. This isn't about fixing anything. It's about making you feel what I felt. Every lie, every betrayal. You deserve this, Lily. Her face crumpled, tears welling up in her eyes. I made a mistake. I was going to tell you about Nathan, but you didn't, I cut in, my voice sharp. You didn't because you thought you could have it all. You thought you could plan your exit, lie to me, and get away with it. You were wrong. She broke then, sobbing, crumbling under the weight of everything she'd lost in a single day. I watched her, the woman I'd loved once, reduced to this, a shell of the person she'd pretended to be. There was no satisfaction in it, not the kind I'd thought there would be, just emptiness. I'm leaving, I said, turning away from her, heading toward the stairs. Don't bother calling me. Don't try to fix this, it's over. I walked up the stairs, leaving her behind, her sobs echoing through the empty house. By the time I reached the bedroom, I could barely hear her anymore. I grabbed the last of my things, my mind already miles away. I stood outside the house a few minutes later, the cold night air biting at my skin. The sky was clear, stars scattered across it like distant memories. I could hear the faint hum of the city in the distance, but everything else was quiet. Lily's world had fallen apart. The papers were signed. The affair exposed. Nathan's life would crumble soon enough, and Heather would make sure of that. I could have stayed to watch it all unfold, but I didn't need to. It was already done. As I drove away, the house fading into the distance, I didn't feel victory. Not really. There was no joy in revenge, no moment of triumph. It was hollow, a means to an end. I had destroyed Lily, but in doing so, I destroyed the life I thought we'd had. There was nothing left for either of us, and that was the point. Lily would come home tonight to a life in ruins, and I would be gone, a ghost in the wreckage of her decisions, just like she deserved. Lily's world fell apart with the same precision that I had planned it. The fallout hit her like a slow, inevitable collapse, one piece after another, crumbling under the weight of her choices. First, it was her career. The office that once respected and admired her was now a hostile environment. The whispers, the looks, the shift in tone, people knew. Heather had made sure of that, and Lily couldn't walk through those doors without feeling the suffocating weight of judgment. Her colleagues avoided her, the pity in their eyes barely masking their disdain. The professional world Lily had built so carefully was unraveling, just like the marriage she had tried to keep hidden behind her lies. Meanwhile, Nathan was scrambling. Heather had turned over every stone in their relationship, exposing every dark secret, every manipulation. His law firm was conducting an internal review, probing his personal affairs and professional conduct. There were whispers of misconduct, of unethical behavior, things that had nothing to do with his affair with Lily, but everything to do with the collapse of his career. His position at the firm, once secure and respected, was slipping away. I had nudged that along, of course. A few anonymous tips here, a few well-placed rumors there, and Nathan was left to watch his own professional life slip through his fingers. It wasn't long before Lily and Nathan turned on each other. I expected it. In moments of crisis, people cling to their own survival. They'll do anything to stay afloat, even if it means dragging others down with them. Lily's texts became erratic, desperate. I read them all, forwarded to me through Heather. Nathan wasn't answering her calls anymore. He wasn't the savior she'd built him up to be. He had his own problems now, and Lily was just another complication he couldn't afford. She had bet everything on a future with him, and now that future was collapsing in front of her. As for me, I made sure to disappear from her life entirely. The house was a ghost of what it had been, empty, stripped of anything that held meaning. I had severed all ties. My phone was off, my email closed, my accounts emptied into places she could never reach. Lily tried to reach out at first, calls, texts, desperate voicemails. Each one was left unanswered. The harder she tried to connect, the more isolated she became. I spent those first few weeks in a new apartment, miles away from the wreckage of our marriage. The place was simple, minimalist, and bare. I hadn't brought much with me, just the essentials. I didn't need anything else. I wanted to start fresh, without the weight of what had happened hanging over me. My nights were quiet. I'd sit by the window, a drink in hand, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, feeling the silence settle around me like a second skin. Every now and then, I'd hear from Heather. She didn't gloat. There was no need to. We both knew the score, and there was a kind of unspoken understanding between us. We had done what needed to be done, and now we were letting the dust settle. She updated me on Nathan's downfall, how he was facing disciplinary action at the firm, how his once promising career was now a shadow of what it had been. He had tried to fight back, of course, but the damage was done. His reputation was shattered, his future uncertain. Heather had moved out of their home, taken the kids, and started to rebuild her life. Lily, on the other hand, was floundering. I didn't need to hear it from her directly. It was obvious from the brief glimpses I caught through friends, mutual acquaintances. She had tried to salvage her life, but the doors were closing on her. People who once welcomed her with open arms were keeping their distance now. It was as though they had caught wind of her disgrace and didn't want the stench of it clinging to them. She was ostracized, her reputation in tatters. The person she had worked so hard to become, a respected, admired professional, was gone, replaced by a woman whose infidelity and lies had consumed her. The few times I saw her in passing, by chance, she looked hollow. Her clothes hung a little looser on her. Her hair wasn't as neatly styled as it used to be. There was a haunted look in her eyes, a kind of desperation that comes when everything you thought you had slips through your fingers. She didn't notice me, or maybe she did and just couldn't bring herself to acknowledge it. Either way, I felt nothing. No pity, no anger. Just a strange sense of detachment, like I was watching a stranger fall apart. I thought for a moment that I'd feel victorious, that seeing her so broken would give me the satisfaction I'd been chasing all along, but there was no joy in it. The revenge, though perfect in its execution, left a hollow ache in its wake. I had destroyed Lily, but in doing so, I had destroyed something in myself too. The person I had been before, the man who trusted, who believed in love, in loyalty, he was gone. I had become someone else, someone colder, more calculating. And maybe that's who I needed to be to survive all this, but it didn't feel like a victory. One evening, a few weeks after everything had fallen apart, I saw Lily for the last time. She was standing outside the cafe where we used to go for brunch on weekends, back when life had seemed simple. She looked lost, staring down at her phone as if waiting for a message that would never come. I stayed across the street, out of sight, watching her for a few moments. She looked fragile, defeated. And yet, there was still a part of me that remembered the woman I had loved once, the woman I thought I had built a life with. That part of me felt something, maybe regret, maybe sadness, but it was fleeting. She looked up suddenly, scanning the street, her eyes searching for something, someone. For a split second, I thought she might have sensed me there, but her gaze never settled on me. She turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, and just like that, she was gone. I watched her fade into the distance, feeling nothing but the cold, quiet finality of it all. After that, I stopped keeping track of her. I had no reason to anymore. Lily was a chapter I had closed, a part of my life that no longer existed. I wasn't the same man who had started this journey of revenge, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. There was no going back to who I was before. But there was a strange kind of peace in that realization. I had done what I set out to do. I had reclaimed control of my life, even if it came at a cost. In the months that followed, I settled into my new routine. Work was steady, predictable. The apartment felt more like home. I filled the spaces with new memories, new experiences, though I kept to myself more than I used to. I didn't need to explain myself to anyone. The people who mattered, the few friends I had left, they knew enough not to ask too many questions. Every now and then, I'd hear whispers of Lily's life. She had tried to pick up the pieces, tried to move on, but it wasn't easy. Her professional reputation was beyond repair, and she struggled to find work in the same field. Some said she had started working in a smaller firm, far beneath her qualifications, but even there, she was treated with a cold distance. No one trusted her. No one wanted to be associated with her. Her social life, once vibrant and full of connections, had dwindled to nothing. She was alone, isolated, left to live with the consequences of her choices. I never responded to her attempts to reach out. There were a few emails, scattered calls, messages left on a voicemail I rarely checked. She wanted to talk, to explain, to apologize, but I had no interest in any of it. What was there to say? The damage was done. The life we had was gone, and there was no resurrecting it. I ignored every one of her pleas, knowing that my silence was the final nail in the coffin of whatever hope she might have had left. As for Nathan, I knew he was still fighting to save what was left of his career, but it was a losing battle. Heather had made sure of that. She had rebuilt her life with her children, distancing herself from the wreckage of her marriage. We spoke occasionally, though less often now. There wasn't much left to say between us. We had both moved on in our own ways, but there was an unspoken bond that would always remain. We had torn down the lives of the people who had betrayed us, and there was a strange, quiet satisfaction in knowing we had succeeded. And yet, as I sat in my new apartment looking out over the city, I couldn't help but wonder what it had all cost me. I had won, if you could call it that, but at what price? I wasn't the same man anymore. I was colder, more distant, detached from the world in a way I hadn't been before. The betrayal, the revenge, it had stripped me of something I couldn't quite name. I wasn't sad about it, but I wasn't exactly proud either. It just was. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, I stood on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sky turn shades of orange and red. The city buzzed below, full of life, full of people going about their own business, unaware of the storm I had weathered. I stood there for a long time, feeling the cool air on my skin, thinking about the road ahead. It was unclear, uncertain, but one thing was certain. I was in control of my own destiny now, and that was enough. The city glowed in the distance, the fading sunlight casting a warm orange hue over the skyline. I sat on my balcony, a drink in hand, watching the day slip into night. There was something almost peaceful about it. The quiet, the stillness, it felt like a long exhale after months of holding my breath. The chaos had passed. I had done what I set out to do. Revenge, I learned, is not the wild, fiery satisfaction you expect. It's not the triumphant moment where you stand over the ashes of the person who wronged you and feel complete. It's colder, emptier, a gradual descent into something darker. I had destroyed Lily methodically, piece by piece. But as I sat there, I couldn't ignore the truth. I had destroyed parts of myself too. I thought back to the man I was when this all started. I'd been naive, trusting, believing that my life with Lily was everything I needed. I thought she was the one, but that man no longer existed. He'd been slowly hollowed out by betrayal, and in his place was someone harder. Someone who didn't believe in the fairy tales of love and trust. Someone who had learned that, in the end, you could only rely on yourself. The phone buzzed beside me. I glanced down, already knowing what it was before I even checked the screen. It was Lily. Another voicemail. Another message I wouldn't answer. I scrolled through the notifications without listening, deleting her messages one by one. She was still trying, still grasping at the threads of something that no longer existed. Her words were desperate, pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. But there was no forgiveness left to give. What could she possibly say to make up for what she'd done? How could she explain away the months of lies, the betrayal that had gutted everything we had built? I had made sure to cut her off completely. It wasn't just the physical distance, the apartment miles away from the house we once shared. It was the emotional distance, the impenetrable wall I had built between us. My finances were separated, my accounts locked. I had erased myself from the life we had together. She had no access to me now, no way to reach me, except for these messages that would never be answered. Still, part of me wondered what she was doing in those moments of silence. Was she sitting alone in that empty house, staring at the walls that used to be filled with our memories? Did she think about us, about the life she had ruined with her selfishness? Or was she simply trying to survive the mess she'd created? I heard from mutual friends that Lily had tried to rebuild her life. She had gotten a new job, a far cry from the prestigious firm where she once held so much power. It was small, local, beneath her qualifications. But that's what happens when your name is stained with scandal. People don't trust you. They don't want you around. The whispers follow you everywhere, and no amount of apologies can fix what's been shattered. She had tried to reconnect with old friends too. That part amused me. The ones who hadn't already distanced themselves were keeping her at arm's length now. They knew the story. They knew what she'd done, and none of them wanted to get involved. It's funny how people scatter when they smell the smoke of your life burning down. I sipped my drink, the bitterness of the liquor sliding down my throat. Somewhere, far below, a car alarm went off, the noise cutting through the quiet evening. I let my thoughts drift, but no matter how far they wandered, they always circled back to the same thing. The cost of it all. I had won, yes. But it didn't feel like a victory. There was no joy in knowing I had torn her life apart. Just a grim sense of finality. I hadn't done it out of spite. I hadn't even done it because I wanted to hurt her. I'd done it because I needed to regain control. To prove that I wasn't a man who could be walked over, discarded, betrayed without consequence. I'd felt powerless when I first discovered the affair. Helpless. Like my entire world had been torn away from me in an instant. I needed to take that power back, to reclaim the narrative, and I had. But in doing so, I'd become someone else. Someone I wasn't entirely sure I liked. The person I was now was colder, more detached. I looked at people differently, through a lens of suspicion. Trust wasn't something I gave freely anymore. How could I, after everything I'd been through? How could I ever let someone that close again, knowing how easily they could turn around and betray you? The truth is, Lily's affair had left deeper scars than I'd ever admit. Not because I still loved her, not in the way I once had. No, that love had died the moment I read those emails, the moment I realized she'd been sharing herself with someone else. But the betrayal, the lies, they had changed me. They had altered the way I viewed the world, the way I viewed relationships, people. Maybe that was the real cost of all this. Not the loss of Lily or the destruction of our marriage, but the part of me that had been shattered in the process. The part that once believed in love, in trust, in loyalty. That part of me was gone now, and I wasn't sure if it was ever coming back. I leaned back in my chair, staring up at the sky as it darkened. The stars were beginning to peek through, tiny pinpricks of light in the vast expanse of night. I wondered if Lily ever thought about that, the life we could have had if things had been different. If she hadn't betrayed me, if we hadn't ended up here, on opposite sides of this cold, final divide. But it didn't matter. What was done, was done. I thought about Heather, how she had picked up the pieces of her life after Nathan. She had moved on, built something new for herself and her kids. We didn't talk much anymore, but the few times we did, there was a sense of closure in our conversations. We had both gotten what we needed from this. We had both walked away, knowing we had set things right in our own way. She asked me once if I felt any regret. If I ever questioned whether we had gone too far, I didn't have an answer for her then, and I wasn't sure I had one now. Did I regret what I had done? No, regret wasn't the right word, but I couldn't deny the hollowness that lingered in the aftermath. I couldn't pretend that this hadn't changed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Sometimes, late at night, I'd find myself wondering if I'd lost more than I gained. Was there a part of me that had been consumed by this revenge, a part I'd never get back? Maybe. Probably. But there was no point in dwelling on it. I had done what I set out to do. I had balanced the scales. And in the end, that was all I could ask for. As the night grew darker, I stood up, finishing the last of my drink. The city stretched out before me, full of life, full of possibilities. Somewhere out there, Lily was living with the consequences of her choices. And somewhere else, Heather was rebuilding, stronger than before. And me? I didn't know what came next. The road ahead was unclear, but for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of the uncertainty. I had faced the worst, survived it, and come out the other side. There was a strange sense of peace in that. I turned away from the city, stepping back into my apartment. The door clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing in the quiet space. I didn't know where this path would lead, but I knew one thing for sure. I was in control now, of my life, of my choices, of my future. And that was enough. The end.